going to have a look now at women in the Imperial age. I can't reduce this any more than I've already reduced it, so you'll have to take notes as you go along. Augustus introduced a number of new laws called his marriage reforms. And the intention was that if he introduced these laws, he would strengthen the institution of marriage. He would encourage larger families. Population size was perhaps something of a concern in the late Republic, early Imperial age. 100 years of civil war would meant population perhaps had fallen to an unworkably low level. But also during that time, lots of fathers are away at war, lots of sons are away at war, lots of husbands are away at war. The birth rate had fallen. So Augustus was attempting to get people to stay together in marriage in order to have larger families. And he also wanted to punish adultery. In the video on Augustan propaganda, I may have mentioned that Augustus was very keen to identify himself with the Roman virtue pietas, Pietas. And this was the idea of being religiously upright. But he also wanted to be identified with virtus, virtus. We would translate it as virtue, but it actually meant a whole code of masculine behavior. But part of that was to do with being a good father, being a good husband, and that meant faithfulness in marriage. So by proposing these laws, Augustus was identifying to the entire Roman Empire that these concepts were important. Strong marriage, large families, nobody being unfaithful. So let's have a look at one of these laws anyway. He intended to, the laws that he introduced punished any man between the age of 25 and 60 who wasn't married, and equally any woman between 20 and 50. The idea was if you put in place a financial penalty, people would marry in order to avoid it. Seems logical enough. If you were unmarried and childless, you were also to be punished through the marriage reforms by the loss of your right to inherit property. Again, if you came from especially a wealthy family, if your parents were aware that they could not leave property to you because you were unmarried and you hadn't had kids, maybe your parents would be more interested in pushing you into a marriage. But it was, again, governments often make the move that in order to get people to do something, you must hit them in their pocket. And that's as true of the marriage reforms of Augustus as it is of the 5p charge for a plastic carrier bag. It's not enough just to say to people, please look after the environment. If you hit them in their pocket, they're more likely to actually do it. And this was Augustus's thinking here. He also was not a fool, and in the marriage reforms, he outlawed long engagements. It would be very logical, a move for a bachelor who did not want to get married to become betrothed to an 8-year-old girl. And that would mean they could not be married for X number of years, which would mean that for that time he escaped the marriage reforms, the new marriage laws, and was allowed to live pretty much the life he wanted. But Augustus banned long engagements. The parents of large families were rewarded with the jus trium liberorum, the right or the law, the justice of 3 children. This gave the man in the relationship enhanced status in his political career. So if he were in public service, if he were on the cursus honorum, he would have better chances of ascending the ladder if he had 3 children or more. Mothers who had 3 or more children provided they were free women. They could not be freed women. They had to be born of free parents. They would gain legal independence, and that meant they could administer their own affairs without a male guardian or tutor, which is kind of ironic that the Jus Trium Liberorum, used in order to encourage strong marriages, actually bestows greater independence on women in those marriages. Okay. It also increased the amount of property a woman could inherit. She could administer that. So again, we've got greater independence. You can see this as a really attractive proposition to women in ancient Rome. It also restricted the husband's power to dispose of property that had come into his possession as a dowry. Now that would certainly give women an incentive to marry and to have children, but it would also discourage men from divorce. You don't rush into a divorce if it's going to cost you property that came to you as part of a dowry. And finally, the Jus Trium Liberorum gave women the further independence that they could register the birth of their children themselves. Previously, that had to be done by a man, so they could actually go to the censor, themselves to register their children. Well, this all looks like an attractive proposition, especially for Roman women. There were punishments on the other side, though. He made adultery a punishable offence. Adulterous women were exiled or given hard labour. They would lose a third of their property. They would lose half their dowry. A man who found his wife cheating on him was obliged by law to divorce her. The idea that she could cheat on him and he would forgive her and they could make it up in a more they couldn't seek a reconciliation with one another. No, if it happened, the man had to divorce her. And if he failed to divorce her, a third party, somebody not in the marriage, could bring the charge and have them divorced. A wronged wife, a wife whose husband had been cheating on her, she did not have the right to bring a charge against him. So it's still sexist. And I can't help but remember that Augustus himself, according to Suetonius, had a number of affairs, and this law, of course, would have meant that Livia could not bring a charge against him, which is convenient. Her father could bring a charge if he could prove the adultery. So the woman herself cannot bring a charge of adultery against her husband, but if her dad can prove that it happened, then he could do it. So again, the power within the law still is in the hands of men. A man who was found guilty of adultery lost half of his property. He would be exiled, and he would be deprived of the right to be a witness in legal matters. This could be a matter of being a witness to a contract being signed, a witness to a marriage, a witness to a legal prosecution, anything in the law. He lost his status as a witness. Of all of Augustus's reforms, I think his marriage reforms are considered to be the least effective of all of them. Because people could marry for convenience. If you knew that you were going to be punished for not getting married, and you knew somebody else who was going to be punished for not being married, then you might enter into a marriage just to escape the punishment. They would marry for convenience. And of course, it's very difficult to enforce laws on such personal matters. In addition, exceptions very often had to be made. So, for example, a family who had 2 children and they were trying for children, but they couldn't have any more children, that would have been unbelievably cruel to exclude them. And the Jus Trium Liberorum was often granted to people who didn't qualify. I mean, the most famous example of that is Augustus's wife Livia. She had 2 children, 2 sons. But she was still given the status of the Jus Trium Liberorum. Hypocritical? Who knows? Ineffective? It seems pretty much. There were changes to the divorce laws. Previously, divorce had been a matter for the individuals. Husband and wife would come to a decision regarding whether to stay together or divorce. But under Augustus, he now compelled the man to divorce an adulterous wife, as we've mentioned, and bring the prosecution against her. But there was a formal procedure for the notification of divorce. You remember that phrase, take your things and go? Not enough now. A formal divorce had to be witnessed by 7 adult male citizens. So it became a very formal process to divorce somebody. I'm sure you may have questions, and if you do, you can ask me them in class.